Thank you for coming today. My name is Laurie Schreiner. I chair the Department of Higher Education here at Azusa Pacific University. And each July, we hold a critical issues seminar in which we bring in a thought leader in the field of higher education to help us wrestle with some of the current issues and challenges that face our field. And we are delighted to have as our guest today Dr. Julie Park. She joins a long line of distinguished scholars who have been brought to our campus, and I have asked one of our faculty, Dr. Young Kim, to introduce Julie.
Good morning, my name is Young Kim. I'm a professor of higher education at Azusa Pacific University. And it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker, Dr. Julie Park. Dr. Park is Associate Professor of Education at University of Maryland. And she is one of the most prominent and influential scholars in higher education. With her expertise in race, religion, and diversity and equity in higher education, she not only published her works in many top-tier academic journals, but also she communicated her findings to a wider audience through her commentary on venues like the Washington Post, the Huffington Post, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. She is the author of a best-selling book, When Diversity Drops, where she examined how universities are affected by bans on affirmative action. And her new book, Race on Campus, is coming soon in this October. She is the winner of ASH and ACPA Emerging Scholar Awards, and she is currently the PI on a $500,000 research grant funded by National Science Foundation. In a personal note, I have known her since we met as peers in the doctoral program in higher education at UCLA, and she has been such an inspiration to me and many others. Particularly, her way of faith integration has greatly impacted me and others in terms of how we can reveal our Christian identity through our scholarly works. So today, she will talk about interrelationship between race and religion and community cultural wealth, and also drawing on empirical studies. She will also address and unpack some misconceptions that exist regarding diversity in higher education. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Julie Park.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kim, for that kind welcome. What Dr. Kim didn't say is that when I was a first-year graduate student, she took me under her wing and taught me everything that I know now. And so I am anything that I have achieved, I am forever in debt. And she didn't mention on that grant, we are working together, and I couldn't do anything really without her, and so it's been a relationship. So it's a lesson that the connections and friendships and relationships that you make in graduate school will truly last a lifetime. And so I've been so blessed through her and the other faculty here at APU. I can't think of sort of a faculty cohort where there are so many amazing people. Don't tell other institutions, but certainly you're incredibly blessed to be able to work with the all-stars here at APU. So I'm so delighted to be here. I haven't been to California in about a year, but we come frequently because my parents live in Orange County, my sister's family, my brother's family lives in West LA, and so being here is such a treat. And I even have a trip planned to Donut Man in Glendora, 10 minutes up here. I'm hoping to get the strawberry donuts. I promised my husband that I would pick up a few on the way, and so what's not to like about being here? All right. So as Dr. Kim mentioned, today, my first talk, I'm going to talk about some of the concepts that I've been gluing together in my mind. And although this work is actually really, it's not even hot off the press. It's a paper that's been under review and has been going from journal to journal, and some people give good feedback, and other people have been pushing back a little bit. And so this is really some of my more recent work. Before I go into it, I have to give credit to my graduate students, or one who used to be at Maryland and now is at USC, Jude Paul Dizon, and then Moya Malcolm, who's a PhD student at the University of Maryland, College Park. They have been my collaborators. They have pushed me. They have done so many literature searches up and down the block, and so I'm so grateful for that. So something that's special to talk about this work is that it really is, I think, we think a lot about how our personal identity and our experiences, right, are oftentimes what lead us to our research topics. And what's funny is about me, even though I grew up in the church, I grew up going to a Korean immigrant church in particular, which is a very specific experience, a unique yet semi-universal experience for a sliver of the population. And it's interesting because in that immigrant church, it was really where I began to ask some of my first questions and make my first observations around issues of race, ethnicity, immigration, and difference. And so questions like, why is it during most of the week my parents are just kind of by themselves, right, in our home, but then we go to this place once a week and suddenly they're alive in a different way that they aren't the rest of the week? What is that? Why is it that when I go to school, I feel a certain way, but then when I come here and I hang out with people that maybe look like me, I feel a different way? And so I didn't know it in the works, but there was a budding researcher as the wheels were turning in my 7-year-old brain. And so, as I mentioned, I grew up in the great state of Ohio, which is probably an especially fertile ground to be asking these questions. And when I went to graduate school, I don't know why everyone's laughing. Ohio's awesome. When I went to graduate school, when I finally went to UCLA, I grew up in the Midwest, but I did want to live in California for at least one time in my life. So I did my PhD studies at UCLA with Dr. Kim, and I did not go to graduate school thinking that I would study anything related to religion. That wasn't on my radar. I went to graduate school because I was interested in race and diversity and studying the educational benefits that are linked with diversity. And so it was really a surprise dissertation topic, which might be something that some of you could relate to as you're going through what feels like a very dark forest trying to figure out your question or your topic of interest. Well, sometimes you can end up in surprising places. And there were a few things that sort of jump-started my thinking. One was for a qualitative research methods class. I had to go somewhere and observe everywhere for 4 hours a week. So I ended up going to a nearby campus fellowship that was somewhat racially diverse in composition. And I sat there every week for a couple of hours and wrote field notes, et cetera. And I became interested in how those students dealt with race on a day-to-day basis. And I became fascinated because on this particular campus, most of the campus fellowships were either almost all white or they are almost all Asian American. And there were quite a few of them that were predominantly Asian American in composition. So this group stuck out because they were one of the more mixed groups. But what really surprised me was when I was doing interviews with students and they said, yeah, we're diverse. We're the most diverse group on campus for campus fellowships, but we're not as diverse as we used to be. And that made me curious. And so that brought me down through the rabbit hole, which ultimately became my dissertation topic and the topic of my first book, which was a case study of this campus fellowship in looking at how the broader demographic changes that had occurred at that university, in particular due to the drop in Black enrollment with Prop 209, affected their ability to maintain this racially diverse community. And so at the same time, I was working as a graduate student to pay the bills at the Spirituality and Higher Education project, which was run by Sandy Aston, who I believe was last year's very distinguished speaker. And I had the privilege of learning from him and Lena Aston and others on this question of how does spirituality matter in higher education. And so it was really fun to be going out and doing my field work, and then at the same time being able to look at some of these questions with actual data and to explore the role of spirituality and religion in students' lives. And I have to give credit to the Spirituality Project because even though my dissertation wasn't directly linked, I didn't use that data for my dissertation. That project that was sponsored by the Templeton Foundation really, I think, gave some legitimacy to being able to talk about spirituality more openly in higher education. And I took it for granted, really, that I could just go anywhere and talk about my work and not have people, scrutinize me too much. But really, it was a significant thing that opened the doors for some of my own research. And so from there, I continued to study this intersection of race and religion in different ways. I did different studies that, drawing on my own sort of observations that I had made in LA and going to K-Town all the time and making observations about the ethnic economy. And that led me to some studies that actually looked at the role of religious involvement for Korean American and Chinese American youth, and how as part of the ethnic economy, there are immigrant churches that facilitate the flow of information around education. I did studies on religious student organizations as one of many different co-curricular involvements, and looked at the link with interracial friendship, or the impact on interracial friendship. And then, of course, the book. So as I developed, as a budding scholar, I began to carve out a reputation and a sort of identity as, oh, she studies religion and spirituality and also race ethnicity. And that led to something kind of funny. People started coming up to me at conferences. I started getting emails from people who said, I know nothing about spirituality. I know nothing about religion, but I'm seeing it in my data. I'm seeing it when I'm studying students of color. And they're talking about how their faith is really important to them in hanging on through different challenges, in persevering through hardships. What do I do? They're all a little distraught, like, what do I do? What do I make of this? Who can I cite? And so it's like, okay, so I started, the first time I was like, oh, whatever, and I pointed them to a few references. But then once it started coming up a few times, I was like, okay, there's a pattern, make a note of that. And so I thought, well, okay, I started having these conversations with some people, and someone came up, some of the language we started throwing around, and someone was like, well, what about thinking of it as sort of spiritual capital, right? As this idea that students are who draw on spirituality as a resource and an asset that they might leverage. And what was funny is, as we did more digging, we actually found out that someone had already written about this term in the literature, and it was a little buried because it wasn't an article. The title was not spiritual capital in Latinx communities. It was buried in this article, which is a very well-read, well-cited article by Lindsay Perez-Huber, who actually teaches down at Cal State Long Beach, an amazing writer. And in this article, Challenging Racist Nativist Framings, Acknowledging the Community Cultural Wealth of Undocumented Chicana College Students to Reframe the Immigration Debate, there was a chunk of her findings that she drew on Tara Yoso's Community Cultural Wealth Framework to analyze her findings about how did these undocumented students, really against the odds, how were they able to persevere in their institutions in a very unfriendly environment. So she talked about how they drew on things like familial capital and social capital and aspirational capital. But then she comes to this part in the article where she says, but there were some things that did not fit neatly in any one of the categories. And she dubbed it spiritual capital, which is a great name because that's what we were thinking of similarly. And so she did that great work. And so today, I'm going to build on her work, and so I'm going to talk some more about, I'll abbreviate it, the Community Cultural Wealth Framework, which was first developed by Tara Yoso and people really just grabbed it and ran with it, and it has taken a life of its own. So I'll abbreviate it sometimes as CCW. I'll elaborate more on this concept of spiritual capital, and talk about the significance of race and religion and spirituality and religion more generally within communities of color, and low-income communities, urban communities, et cetera. We'll talk about the intersection between spiritual capital and other forms of community cultural wealth. And so thinking of how the other forms of capital originally identified by Yoso, so navigational capital, aspirational capital, how spirituality and religion themselves are sources of those forms of capital, and how there is some overlap between spiritual capital and the other forms of capital. And then we'll talk about, well, what else does it do? All right. Okay, so to backpedal a little bit, especially for those of you who aren't familiar with Tara Yoso's work, I'd be curious actually, who here, can you raise your hand if you have read Tara's paper, Whose Culture Has Capital on Community Cultural Wealth? Okay, a chunk, but not everyone, so that's very helpful for me to know. So Tara Yoso wrote this great, very heavily cited paper. She's now a professor at the University of Michigan, and when I was a grad student, I actually got to hear her talk a few times, and she's fascinating because she also has like some interest in theater and film and other interesting things, so she's really cool. So this paper emerged really as a critique of sort of the dominant interpretation of Bourdieu's concept of cultural capital theory. And it's important to say that this cultural capital can oftentimes be interpreted in different ways. But certainly the way that sometimes dominant society has really embraced it is sort of to frame this, to have this idea that there are forms of capital, right, that privileged populations have access to, right? So they can be things like just knowing how to, knowing that you might have an advantage if you apply early decision to a college, or knowing that, having elite tastes, having gone to a lot of museums when you were young, having season tickets to the opera, things like that, and how those things can be actually a form of currency and cachet that can help elites hold on and really reproduce their privilege. And so in the college sector, and Pat McDonough from UCLA wrote a fantastic book that you absolutely have to read, Choosing Colleges, if you haven't, applying this framework to look at how this actually can play out in the realm of college admissions. There's a lot of unsaid information about how to navigate this process that elites have access to. And there's a lot of legitimacy, I think, to Bourdieu's framework. The challenge is how sometimes people use sort of overly broad or careless, I would say, language, right, to talk about different concepts. And so cultural capital is one that people have sort of thrown out, slapdash kind of, to say, well, it's that students of color just don't have this stuff, so they're not doing too great, right? And that explains it all, right? And so it's a very overly simplistic and even a deficit approach, right, where students of color and low-income populations are always framed by what they lack. And we, the great saviors, our job is to give to them so they can make it, right? Instead of recognizing, hey, maybe they have stuff that we can learn from, right? Or maybe they have stuff to actually survive in what are oftentimes openly hostile environments. So Tara's paper, now I notice that only about a fourth of you, maybe a fifth of you raised your hand. So everyone else, I think this needs to be on a syllabus, right? For maybe the upcoming intensive semester. Everyone should read this paper. All right, it's coming, right? And so Tara's paper was awesome because she really sought to, she didn't say like dump the baby out with the bathwater. She said, okay, there is some relevance to Bourdieu's theory, but the way it's been interpreted, misinterpreted, and applied is oftentimes very problematic. And she said, we need to reject these deficit approaches and portrayals of these monolithic portrayals of people of color as only lacking. And so her contribution was to think, well, what are the forms of capital that students of color actually draw on to persevere against the odds? And so she was really drawing from a critical race theory framework to disrupt this master narrative around what may constitute success. And so she worked to address the assets, the strengths, and the funds of knowledge that students of color bring to the table, and looking at their cultural wealth. And it's important, and sometimes, Tara's work has taken on a life of its own, and it's great and it's important. Sometimes I think people almost veer in the other direction, and it's important to recognize how these things coexist alongside entrenched racism and inequality, and how these capital and structural forces intersect is a fascination of mine continually. All right, so just a little bit of overview of critical race theory, which I think many of you will get if you take some of our esteemed faculty, the classes here. So she drew on a CRT framework, which really posits some tenets like that race and racism are endemic to US society. The need to challenge dominant ideologies and narratives, such as the idea that people of color only lack, the centrality of experiential knowledge, that it's not just your book credentials that matter, but also the lived experiences that can include people who didn't go to college, but that there is knowledge, rich heritage, rich assets in these populations. And then a commitment to social justice, that the idea that it's not, knowledge is critical, and there is some role for knowledge and knowledge's sake, but ultimately knowledge is to be used ideally for transforming society. Okay, so in Tara's paper, I won't go too in depth, but she identified the 6 original forms of capital. And so can be overlapped. That was a little awkward. So that was my note to myself. Navigational capital, which she refers to the type of capital that's used to navigate institutions, navigate figuring out how to apply to college, the bewildering thing that can be a FAFSA. How are the ways that students of color get access to information and resources and support that can help them navigate through diverse or complicated institutions? Aspirational capital. What is the capital that helps people keep going against the odds when everyone is saying college isn't for you? Social capital, the importance of connections, networks, relationships, and the resources that are exchanged within them. So for instance, my grant, actually with Dr. Kim, we look a lot at the role of social capital in STEM contexts. Resistance capital, what is capital to be able to resist systems of oppression? Is that not a form of capital itself and something that should be valued and highlighted? Yes. Linguistic capital, this is a really fun one. And when we look at the intersection with spiritual capital, we had a lot of fun with this one. But Tara's work, Dr. Yosa's work, recognized that there is capital, there is treasure within the diverse languages, whether it's switching between multiple languages, whether it's code switching when you're speaking English, but the ability to be able to bounce back and forth between different communities, that's not something that everyone has. And that can be a real source of capital that is underrated and undervalued by dominant society. And familial capital, the role of family, the role of extended networks of kin, of close people that you can call your aunties and your uncles, even if you're not directly related by blood. And how is that something that is tremendously important in propelling especially underserved populations through educational systems? Okay, so certainly these concepts, they counter the idea that communities of color don't have everything. They highlight the assets that these students oftentimes draw on. And it's important to recognize that the community cultural wealth framework does not, even though it's saying, hey, students of color are doing these great things and they're drawing on these forms of capital and they're not just poor and lacking and coming from this so-called culture of poverty, which is another misinterpretation of the cultural capital framework. At the same time, with the critical race theory backdrop, it is recognizing all of this stuff exists in the backdrop of continued entrenched racism, institutionalized racism, economic inequality, the ways that the deck are stacked against people. But with that, looking at the forms of CCW as a form of resistance and hope. And there are some fun spiritual parallels you could draw there. All right, so clearly Dr. Yosa's work has had some influence. It's been cited, the last time I checked, it's been cited 3,600 times and counting. I'm pretty sure that number is higher. It's like at McDonald's, you know, when they have the burgers and they change it, like, and then they just stop changing it because it was, maybe they still change it, I don't know. So it's kind of like that. When we started writing the paper, I think it was like 2,500 times, and then a couple months later, it was like 3,000. So it really is, this is one of the frameworks that keeps on giving. Maybe some of you might use it in your dissertation. Okay, so going on to Lindsay's work, building on Dr. Perez-Huber's work, building on Dr. Yosa's work. And so in this article, she said, hey, there's this thing in my findings that is not fitting neatly into the other boxes. So she had identified forms of aspirational capital and social capital, but she said, where do we put this stuff related to spirituality? And so she describes spiritual capital as a set of resources and skills rooted in a spiritual connection to reality greater than oneself. With that, she noted that spiritual capital can encompass religious, indigenous, and ancestral beliefs and practices learned from one's family, community, and inner self. I really like these definitions. When you're doing any sort of writing on spirituality, spirituality is such a potentially amorphous concept. It's very difficult to pin down in words. So you kind of have to cast this big umbrella. But at the same time, you don't want to water down the definition. You want to have some heft, some definition that there actually is something going on. And I thought that Dr. Perez-Huber actually did quite a nice job in these efforts. So she does recognize that there is overlap with other forms of capital, but that there is also distinction. So as she noted, she said, although we can see these experiences can be connected to forms of other types of capital, what these women describe is something different. Their faith and hope are nurtured by spiritual connection and prove to be powerful resources they draw on to overcome barriers and maintain their aspirations for the future. And I don't think she was alone in this, because when I was reading this, it really made me think of all of the random encounters I've had with other scholars who said, hey, I'm studying students of color, I'm studying college access, and people just keep talking about God, or people talk about spirituality, and where do I put that? I have no idea where to put that. And so I thought Lindsay did a really great job of articulating the home. And so she has some quotes that I wanted to share. This is actually a direct excerpt from her article. She gives the case of a student, Elena, who shared her faith had enabled her to maintain her aspirations. And so this is this quote where she talks about, I know I have to have faith that things are going to turn out, and maybe I have a hard time now, but it's going to get better eventually. And I'm sure all my hard work is going to pay off someday. And then I'm going to say, okay, all of that was worth it. So I think having faith is really important. And I think it's interesting because when you grow up, for those of you who did either grew up in faith communities or have had a certain amount of socialization in faith or religious communities, some of this language or this framework, like, I know it's gonna be okay. I have faith. It's going to, it's not okay now, but it's gonna get better. And that's language that can be easy to take for granted. And it's easy, it's like you're a fish in water, right? You don't think, oh, water, I feel it, right? It's all around you. And so it's really interesting is to get the perspective, especially from scholars, I think, who are doing research on these populations, but might not have that socialization. And they say, where does this come from? It's a real thing that's showing up in some of these interviews, but not all of them, right? Or it's showing up in these students who are actually succeeding and, beating the odds, et cetera. What is this? And so I thought that was really fascinating because, that type of, for those of us who grew up in evangelical circles, people say like Christianese, right? It's like a Christianese or it's just there's like a website, Stuff Christian People Like, and they make fun of all these things that are not universal experiences, but are, a sliver. So this language can be easy to take for granted, but at the same time, it's doing something. It's doing something for these students in these experiences. Okay, and so I think this is my last vignette from her paper. She talks about Daria, who is a second-year psychology major, and I won't read the whole quote, but she said, God has always been there for me to help me get through. There's no problem in my life so big I've never had to overcome thus far, thank God. She talks about her different fears, and she said, God has always put me through it. So it's a big part of her life, and she talks about how it's given her peace. So now I would like to actually take a quick break to talk to your neighbor, right? So I'm about halfway through my presentation, and I would be curious, you've gotten the definitions for spiritual capital and the CCW framework, and I would be curious, just based off of these quotes, where do you see this concept of spiritual capital? And do you see it at all, right? Do you see it at your institutions? Do you see it with students? What populations have you seen it in? Have you not seen it in? If you don't see it at all, you could think about, do you feel like your institution has supported these types of things or given students space to have this type of language? Or are there ways that institutions aren't supporting this type of way of thinking that might actually be quite a resource for students? So yeah, and you can think about different types of institutions you've worked at, maybe differences and similarities. And so maybe 2 minutes, right? Just turn to a neighbor and have a little chat. All right, in the interest of time, I think we're gonna have to move on. Coming back together, coming back together. All right, coming back together, coming back together. My apologies to have to cut off so much lively conversation. I hear you have another week of intensives left, so you're gonna be able to have some rich, ready-made conversation topic whenever you have a class break. This question made me think. So I teach at University of Maryland, College Park, and I love it. We're a land-grant institution and serving the state. And it's interesting because I have, on more than one occasion, I've had students who, they actually don't, in general, some of them come from a faith background, some of them don't, but they all rave about their experience working at Jesuit institutions. And they talk about they say, I miss it. There's so many things I took for granted there, but I miss having that certain values and language that are constantly being reinforced. And so one of those, I remember my student said, I'm mangling the language, but it was something like being a person with and for others, or something like that. And that's such a subtle thing, right? And I'm sure while they were there, they took it for granted, but they said, I come, at other types of institutions, we don't talk that way. And I think there's actually a lot that public institutions, although they are non-sectarian, there's a lot of language that they could use about serving the state, about what does it mean to be an institution that's there for the public, for the people, that we could actually learn from some other institutions that are more explicit about communicating their culture and their values. And so that's interesting. That is what came to mind. All right. Okay, so now, some of you, I'm sure, could think of examples, right, where you've certainly seen forms of spiritual capital with students who aren't students of color, so with white students, with higher SES students. And that's great. That's totally fine and wonderful. So is this a resource that's unique to students of color? Not necessarily. However, what's interesting, and was really interesting to play with in the paper, is that part of what I think can make spiritual capital unique, one of the unique distinctions, is that there are some, if you really nerd out in your qualitative methods course, and you go back to like epistemologies and ontologies and all those complicated terms that your professors throw out. And if you go into that roots, there are these debates. There are these heated debates, and some of it links to, really what are Eurocentric ways of thinking and knowing, like basically, how do you know what you know, right? It's such an esoteric question. But there are sort of these dominant norms in the academy, right, and informed by Eurocentric ways that encourage the separation of thought from feeling and emotion and in the name of rationality, right? And so it was really interesting to think of how bringing these worlds together, the idea that what you know intersects with what you feel, and these things don't, they're not totally, right, separate from each other, that is actually something that also taps into some of the concepts that are linked with spirituality, whether it's, loving God with your whole mind and heart and being, etc., or other indigenous traditions, which certainly put a, huge emphasis on, that you could never divorce what you feel from what you know and what you experience, that those things are intimately commingled. And so certainly spiritual capital is something that all populations, I think, could potentially have access to. But there are some interesting dynamics of it where I think there are some unique connections to some of the values and ways of thinking and knowing that have traditionally been more prevalent within communities of color. All right. So to give you your brief history lesson, if you didn't know, religion and spirituality are certainly critical resources for communities of color. Certainly not all people of color identify with religion or spiritual beliefs systems, but certainly many of them do. There are very complicated histories with race and religion and spirituality. Religion, the name of religion, right, has been something that has been used to both oppress and potentially uplift and serve as a source of resistance for people of color. And so there are complicated histories. There's a historian at, I think, San Diego State now, Ed Bloom, who talks about this term of, and some others have talked about racialized religion or religionized race, where you actually we talk about race and religion oftentimes separately, but actually when we look at what it means, the different configurations of the social construction of race, many of these meanings are intimately tied to religion and or have been done in the name of religion. And so, right, the framing of the savage, right, and how that was something that was used to mark racial otherness, but there's also a very religious bent, right, if you're thinking about what did some of the colonizers, right, use as justifications, right? It was both racial difference and it was religious difference, and you really couldn't separate those two. And so, early history and Ron Takaki's Strangers from a Different Shore has some very good insights on this. So from the beginning, religious differences, and not just racial differences, but really the two together were part of racialization and marking the other. We see this in the history of our country. For instance, Hindu itself used to be the categorization for South Asians. And oftentimes we see it, even today, right, where Muslims, right, are talked about with very sort of blunt language. And when people are talking, in the political discourse about Muslims, they have a certain image and a certain color, right, skin tone, phenotype in mind. Over half of United States Latinx communities identify as Catholic, and only 18% of Latinos and Latinas in the United States do not hold any religious affiliation. So not only do 88% of African Americans affiliate with a religion, but almost 60% of them attend historically Black Protestant churches. So it's not just going to church, it's going to a specific type of church, right? A community that is linked to a very rich history of, of being a site where racial identity was developed. Certainly Indigenous and Native populations, as mentioned, religion being something that was used very much as a tool of subordination, but at the same time, these communities having rich spiritual traditions and ways of thinking and knowing that certainly seek to look beyond the immediate world. Immigrant and second-generation plus community. So that was my own personal experience growing up as the child of immigrants. And there's a saying, it was like wherever Chinese people go, they open a restaurant. Korean people, they open a church. And then later on, a lot of those churches split, so there are even more Korean churches. And what was really interesting about this is that, even observing in Korean American or Korean immigrant churches, that a lot of people would actually go to them that didn't necessarily identify as Christians. It was just that the Protestant church was the dominant sort of all-in-one social services, socialization, socializing, place you do business hub, right? And so people just went to church, whether they had an affiliation or not. Some really interesting work has been done on looking at this is a nice term, the afterlife of religion. And so in communities of color in particular, even when you have people of different races who might not identify as Christian or do not identify as religious, and yet they grew up, hearing gospel music, going to church, or hearing, these different norms and patterns, and part of what it is to understand, Korean culture or Black culture or et cetera, can include some element of familiarity with religious norms and traditions, even if that person themselves do not identify anymore as religious. And so there's some very pronounced social cultural dimensions of religion where there are not really, it's not just that you have your race stuff here and you have your religion stuff here, but part of what it means to develop a racial ethnic identity can involve religious or spiritual socialization. Okay. This quote from Sandra Barnes at Vanderbilt has done a lot of work on African American churches and what they have done to promote educational success for their youth. And so she talks about, I like this, she says, it's important to remember, many churches have youth programs, right, regardless of their ethnic compositions. But she talks about how there's something, she says, qualitatively different about Black church youth programs as compared to white peers. And she talks about, regardless of what's going on in that particular institution, there are elements such as trying to combat the negative effects of African American youth, of racism, poverty, and discrimination, and attempts to supplement diminishing social services in Black communities. She also talks about how church-based initiatives tend to emphasize racial and cultural pride, positive racial identity, as well as self-efficacy, an endeavor to combat economic and social constraints in Black families. And so, in religious institutions, there's a lot going on, including, but not limited to, the actual practice, right, of religion, right? And I think even more so in communities of color where they are traditionally underserved, right, by the government, underserved by social service organizations or public policy, et cetera. And so religious institutions have been there to fill in some of the gaps. And just the very act, as we'll talk about, the very act of being together, right, of having community, of having people that you see every week or every couple of weeks. If their aunties know your business, right, that can actually have a real impact, right, on educational outcomes for youth. Aunties gossiping together, right, about each other's children. That has real implications for educational mobility, and that happens a lot at churches. All right, so I am going to go through talking about how do religion and spirituality, how do they themselves serve as sources of the other forms of community cultural wealth. And so this can help us really understand some of the mechanisms by which spiritual capital is working as a form of community cultural wealth, whether it's spiritual capital, in this case, serving as a source of other forms of capital. And she also talks about this in her paper, how the lines between the different types of capital always aren't cut and dry, right? So in navigational capital, right, part of that might include social capital relationships, right? So likewise with spiritual capital can also serve as a form of aspirational capital or a form of social capital, et cetera. Okay. So, highlighting aspirational capital. So in Yoso's paper, she talks about it representing a culture of possibility, right? The idea of exhibiting hope and optimism in the face of many challenges. And so some of the ways that we found when we did our literature searches in the research on students of color, that ways that spirituality was fostering aspirational capital. Some, for instance, in Dr. Perez Huber's work, she certainly she documented participants talking about how God or some other higher power, right, will make a way when there is no other way. Encouraging the pursuit of life meaning and purpose, providing tangible resources in faith communities to support aspirations. So everyone can dream, but dreams need resources. Sometimes dreams need money, right? Scholarships, other things. And that is something that can happen in faith communities. I remember visiting a friend in Detroit and going to a predominantly African-American congregation in, I think it was May or June, and they applauded graduates, right? And they listed the name of where every single graduate was going to college, and the pastor talked about how proud he was to have gone to University of Michigan, and everyone cheered. And so those are subtle things, right? And things you could just say, oh, it's just banter, right? But that is setting a possibility, right? An example of, hey, this is possible for us. If you are 12 years old there in the audience, this could be possible for you. And encouraging youth in peer networks that are oriented towards achievement and being nerdy and good stuff like that. Okay, so Perez Huber talked about, not all nerds, no. Perez Huber talked about where she saw this in undocumented Chicana students. I mentioned examples where faith communities may celebrate educational accomplishments. We can think of church banquets or things that can happen at a synagogue or other places. This idea of God having a plan, right? This language that can be so easy to take for granted. But when it comes to mental health, and I'll talk about this later, not everyone has this language or these reservoirs, right, to dwell on. And we find in the research also religious service attendance linked with higher educational expectations I just put one example for Latinx students, but across the literature you see these findings for other groups, and in particular urban youth. Oh, are we frozen? Okay, great. Well, I'll talk about the ones that I am most brief to talk about off the top of my head. So linguistic capital actually was really one of my favorites when we went through this. In Yoso's work, she talks about things like being multilingual. Of course, that is such an asset. Unfortunately, oftentimes it's not uncommon. I have gotten complimented on English, and I say, thanks, it's the only language I know, unfortunately. I wish I knew more. Thanks, I've been speaking it my whole life. So anyway, if you speak more than one language, kudos to you. And I look at my poor baby, and I'm like, oh, you're really probably going to only speak English. Fortunately, his father speaks Mandarin, so he might pick that up. So multilingualism, but also there's things like code switching, right? So being able to shift back and forth between different types of dialect and being able to feel comfortable in those situations. And so it was really fun when we were looking at religion and spirituality as resources. Some of the things that came up were the language that could be developed. First of all, oftentimes immigrant religious institutions being literal sites where multilingualism is fostered. So language school, oftentimes I went to Korean school, I was a failure. I went to Korean school every Sunday after service until I was allowed to quit when I was 15 or so, and it didn't work that well for me, but I know a lot of people who it was helpful. And even if it didn't work fully for me, I do understand more than I think I otherwise would, which is not insignificant, right? So oftentimes, and not just churches, but synagogues or temples or mosques, right? So it's kind of a fun experience where, if you meet someone who grew up, even if they don't share your specific religious identity, but you meet someone, you're like, language school, and they're like, oh, yes, Saturdays or Sundays. Okay, and then other things, let's see, maybe I can just jump, I'll go back. Okay, linguistic capital, okay. So as defined by Perez Huber, by Yoso, learning the language of resilience, culture, and self-affirmation. So communities may provide avenues to learn the home language. You can link spiritual expression, so language that itself is used to in worship or in other things. can be a source of language that can also link to agency or people feeling a sense of self-efficacy or being able to make it. And then also it can create a language, shared language of community engagement and activism. So I've talked about the first point, and then also religious communities, especially multi-generational ones, right, where people are bouncing back and forth between languages. And so a lot of these religious institutions, whether it's a mosque or a church, an immigrant church, et cetera, people are speaking multiple languages. And that's another way that linguistic capital can be fostered. And then even in the African American church, especially, there are traditions like Youth Sunday, which I found were really fascinating, where the young people actually run the service for the Sunday. And I was like, that sounds awesome. But if you think about that, what are the skills and competencies that are being built by that, right? The ability to feel confident, speaking at a podium, talking to adults, and providing opportunities for public speaking and leadership. So linguistic capital doesn't have to be limited to other languages, right? It can be also fostered within religious institutions and communities where youth are actually given spaces of their own, and the ability to learn how to speak confidently or to speak publicly actually can be a valued asset in itself. All right, I'm gonna move back to resistant capital. All right, challenging norms through opposition and transformative action. And so some of the ways that we found that religious communities or spiritual communities were sources of resistant capital include offering culturally relevant pedagogy, insights, and resources that can challenge dominant narratives, being a source of protest, organizing collective action, certainly to protest inequities and injustices. And we see that, I know, in many communities, and it's neat to be able to see religious communities oftentimes taking the leadership or being a voice for the voiceless. So examples, of course, so for anyone who ever gets pushback against studying religion or spirituality, you can just say, hey, Martin Luther King Jr., Cesar Chavez, right? Some of these people that you may have heard of, right? Religion and spirituality were at the foundation, right, of their resistance. And certainly faith communities mobilizing for collective action. If you read Obama's memoir, Dreams from My Father, which is one of my favorite books, he talks about how, as an organizer, a lot of his meetings and a lot of his efforts to outreach to the community in Chicago happened in just everyday, churches. Familial capital. Thinking of pedagogies of the home and lessons that are taught in relationships with elders, with young people. And so this was another really fun and interesting one, where spiritual capital can complement familial capital, where it can, for instance, provide spiritual language, right, in a component to child upbringing. Part of this is making me think of, I just saw Coco recently, and so if anyone can think of, right, and so this language, right, and talking about the spirit world and the family, right, and the value of family that was so well done there, and so, I should add that. Okay, it can strengthen the connections to family and thus inspire resilience and motivation. And then one of my favorites is really that religious or spiritual communities can provide networks of extended kin. So people who are not necessarily related to you, but that will have your back and will have your children's back and know their business. And actually in the sociological research, there's a lot of work on this. Coleman's original work on social capital actually occurred through studying Catholic communities and the intergenerational relationships and networks, what he called closed functional communities, where people know each other's kids and look out for them and are bugging them, right? And, because sometimes kids don't want to listen to their parents, I'm told, but they might listen to an auntie or an uncle or a role model, right? An older brother. So just the very act of religious spaces and spiritual spaces are places where people come together and do life and can build family, whether it's strengthening bonds within the direct family, right? Or the extended network of kins. And this makes me think of immigrant churches where, and I think oftentimes religious institutions in communities of color, you have men and women who are oftentimes kind of marginalized, right, by dominant white society, but they might hold a leadership role in that religious institution. And so thinking of, people that I knew who they said, my father is a janitor, but at church he's a deacon, right? So what does that mean in a very subtle role, in a subtle way for the socialization of a child, right, who might be used to seeing his parents, right, as, marginalized in one realm, but being able to see his parents as leaders, right, in another realm. And I know that was actually part of my experience. My dad was the choir director. All right. So religious communities provide aunties and uncles. They can provide programming, and there's also something even in Korean. I heard in Korea, and they kind of have them in some Korean American communities, it's called like father school, where it's actually a school to learn to be a good dad. And a lot of these men say like, I don't have a role model, or my father, didn't know how to express his emotions, and I want to do that differently for my children. So some churches actually hold these. It's called father school. Fascinating. So, and venues for parents to display and exert leadership in front of their children. Okay. Gone over linguistic capital. Social capital, as I mentioned, communities are a place where people do life together. And once again, this is something that can be easy to take for granted if you have it. But, Robert Putnam, the famous political science, talks about how religious communities are America's #1 source of social capital in the country. And certainly there are complicated dynamics to that. But when they are at their best, they can provide venues where people can form enduring bonds of trust, which is the juice that makes social capital work. And so I've done some work on this myself, how ethnic churches, temples, and mosques are part of the broader ethnic economy. They can provide, so along with grocery stores and other small businesses that can cater towards a particular community, oftentimes religious institutions are part of that infrastructure. And they are places where people get together and gossip about their kids and pass around information about what are you doing, or what should I make my kid do this summer? Oh, you're sending your kid to camp. Okay, my kid's gonna go too. And all of that information sharing, right, has a real impact actually on education, especially for people who aren't familiar with the way that the educational system works in this country. There's a great book that highlights interfaith mobilizing in Texas and looking at some of the Dry Bones Rattling by Warren, that's the name, great title. How these communities were able to connect low-income communities and congregations with more affluent partners to really mobilize for social justice. And we see a lot of this on the ground, in Ferguson, the Black Lives Matter movement, et cetera. And then in my own work, I also found that students who identified as Hindu had higher levels of parental network closure, which is a fancy term for your parents knowing your friends. And that's, it sounds insignificant, but that is actually people knowing what's going on in their kids' life is actually a really important thing towards stability, general stability, and parents being able to be involved in their children's education. Navigational capital, as I've highlighted, and so this has been documented. Michelle Espino, my colleague, did great work where Mexican-American PhDs oftentimes reference spirituality as something that helped them make it through their education. Urban Youth, Daniel Liu at Arizona State, has done great work, and where urban youth talked about how they felt disconnected from their schools, but their church actually was something that helped them be able to persist, where they felt a sense of connection and identity. And then Jamie Liu has a fantastic book where she looks at Korean American, both low income and higher income students, and she talks about how church communities were really vital for them to gain access to information on how to apply to college. Okay, so certainly spiritual capital intersects with these original 6 forms of capital. It can exert its own independence, right? And I think Dr. Prez-Huber's work is great because she said, I tried to put it in other boxes, I tried to put this, but there's something unique, there's something special, right, about this idea that spirituality can make a difference and can give people language to be able to persist through tremendous challenges. And what's really interesting, in thinking, what are some of the characteristics, in trying to boil down definitions, some of the things that we were thinking of, well, what makes spiritual capital unique, right? Why can't we just say, well, it's just social capital, or it's just navigational capital? And that was really emphasizing the unique character, some of these traits and links to concepts like transcendence, or the idea of a higher power, or things like that, and how they were repeated and how they cut across the other forms of capital were some of the things that confirmed for me that, yeah, this is something unique. Okay, and so spiritual capital being really the means by which spirituality or religion can exert a positive impact or link a person or community to valued resources. I can't go into too much depth because I'm running out of time, but in our paper, we're exploring some of the other unique ways that spiritual capital has an impact on communities of color. And so we highlight things like mental health, where religious or spiritual involvement can help people of color persist through the many challenges that they face that can include racial microaggressions, tokenization, racial battle fatigue. And this is especially important because oftentimes people of color face special stigma around mental health issues, certainly within my own community, I see that. And so there are some great studies that highlight how religious involvement is linked with positive mental health outcomes for African American students. Christina Ye, who's a faculty member at University of San Francisco, has done a great series of studies of looking at spirituality in Samoan students and looking at how spirituality was critical for their mental health. Identifying as Catholic has linked positively with well-being for Latinx students and also religious involvement for Asian American students, a paper that I did with Lisa Malora. Okay, I'm gonna have to blitz through these slides. But, and it's really interesting because these are things that, you know, if you grow up in the culture, they can be easy to take for granted. And yet, it's something that not everyone has. We also highlight spiritual capital as a source of resiliency, and certainly resiliency has some overlap with things like resistance or aspirations, et cetera, but it also has its own sort of distinctiveness in thinking of resiliency as something that really is summing up, how do you survive, right? How do you just make it? And so in our work, we talk about how spirituality can promote resiliency by helping youth of color make sense of hardships, resist depression, cope with stress. It can be a protective factor against things like anxiety, drug use, et cetera. Okay. And then lastly, spirituality and indigenous forms of knowledge. This is another one of my favorite ones that I felt like I learned a lot from doing this paper. And so thinking about how spirituality promotes these ideas that in some level all living people have value, are sacred, are connected to one another. And there's some really interesting work by Riyad Shanajan who talks about how colonial forces really used a very intentional separation between spirituality and knowledge, the legitimization of knowledge was used as a form of oppression. And so in the paper, we talk about some of the limitations of spiritual capital and spirituality and religion themselves. So certainly we all know that religion and spirituality can be practiced well. They can be practiced very poorly as well. Not all people of color certainly identify with religion or spirituality. And then, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes spirituality can be hard to define, hard to put your finger down on, and so that can be a challenge also with the framework in being able to say, does this qualify, does that qualify, is our umbrella too broad? There certainly is a need to advance the research by talking about how community cultural wealth intersects with other forms of structural inequality itself. Understanding, you know, are all forms of capital equally valuable? Jenna Sablon, who's a postdoc actually at Maryland and a USC alum, did some really great work looking at this. And then also looking at how does the ability to both access and leverage, not just spiritual capital, but other forms of community cultural wealth, how does that vary both within populations and between populations? And why is it that, you know, you don't want to paint an overly broad picture and just say like, oh, if you go to church, you're going to be fine. Obviously, we know that's not the case. So thinking of it, why is it sometimes people might have what seem like similar experiences, but people can have very different outcomes at the individual or group level? Also, you may have heard of the rise of the religious nuns. That's a really important thing to look at and how that trend within communities of color. The role of changing demographics also for religious institutions and the communities that they inhabit. So for instance, religious institutions that may have been centered in the city, right, but now are in the suburbs or other things, or how do demographic trends influence some of the intersections with spiritual capital. So just to wrap it up, spiritual capital, it gives us some language, right? So when many people were coming to me and saying, how do you make sense of this, right? Where do you put this? When people are just suddenly talking about God in my interview, what could you use? What could you cite? And so thinking about spiritual capital, it certainly doesn't apply to everyone, but it can be a unique resource for those who are able to leverage it. And then certainly it can serve as an additional source of community cultural wealth for the other 6 forms of capital. All right, so with that, thank you very much. Questions?
A little bit of time for a couple of questions before we take a break. And if you have questions you want to ask at this point?
Got a couple of questions over here.
So as someone that works in a Christian college, I've seen people try to increase, or our white, I guess, institutions try to increase spiritual capital in our students, especially our students of color, and say, oh, have more gratitude, pray more, but then perpetuate the same injustices.
Yeah.
So how do you work through encouraging students to develop spiritual capital, which I think is essential for survival,
Yeah.
with, because the resistance part also is draining too, right? And so if you're protesting or you're pushing against the institution, that can maybe in some ways diminish spiritual capital, or it just maybe draws from it. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so it's interesting because maybe more so than the other 6 forms of community cultural wealth, there could be a dark side, and maybe you could even argue that spirituality used in that context is not spiritual capital because it's not something that's actually helping people, right? So you could use spiritual language, but not be helping someone or not be doing what's really best for them, right? So there can be the spiritualization, right, or spiritualese, right, using spiritual language, right, as something that can hurt people. I mean, certainly that is what was done where, the Civil War, you had a whole side that justified themselves. They said, we're fighting God's battle, right, to legitimize the continuation of slavery. So in those cases, I would say that is just not spiritual capital. But I think what you highlight, and I know I've seen this in some writing, which I wanted to include in this paper, I want to say by Michael Apple and Zeus Leonardo, where they talked about how sometimes sort of the dark side, right, and how spiritual and religious language can be used to justify, just putting up with things or not challenging the status quo, or for people just to be content, right, with the little that they have. So yeah, you bring up a really important point. Sounds like it could be a great paper.
Got another question over here. This is Kathy Cito. Why don't you introduce yourself for your question?
Like Chris says, I'm Kathy Cito. Good morning, Dr. Park. My question is, you had a statement on one of the slides that seemed to link religion with Asian American students and SAT prep.
Oh, yeah.
Now, did you refer to it just as like, oh, the aunties are talking in church about, oh, when did you sign your kid up for SAT prep, or is it something more than that?
Yeah, it's a lot of that. Actually is a lot of it. I have a paper where we found for Korean American youth. So something that's interesting is that Korean American youth have a especially high rate of involvement in SAT prep, and it's not a huge surprise if you're familiar kind of with that community. But in that paper, we found that Korean American students themselves, if they identified as Protestant, they were more likely to participate in SAT prep activities. And that was a quantitative paper. So we found this pattern in the data. But what's fun is that you have to provide some sort of interpretation. And people might think, quant work is always really cut and dry, but you have to provide some sort of interpretation or explanation. And so what we suggested is that for those students who are identifying as Protestant, and I think we also found a positive effect for participation in religious services. And so we said, well, if they're Protestant, they're probably going to, Korean churches where they're in contact with same ethnicity people who are probably talking about things like SAT prep, comparing their children. And there's certainly a dark side in that too, I talk about in the paper. So there are intersections where religious involvement can have positive benefits, but then also involvement can have, a dark side too. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to take a break now for about 10 minutes, and you can, the restrooms are downstairs, out the front or back, coffee and water, and then we'll start up again at about 10:45 or so with the next session.
All right, great.